My son sent me whiskey for my birthday, but when his FIL drank it, I froze. That morning I thought it was just a gift, a beautiful bottle sealed in wax, with only 2 cold words on a card. Happy birthday. No dad, no signature. My hands shook when I saw my son's handwriting after 3 years of silence. I couldn't drink it, so I passed it on to a man I respected. But the very next day, he collapsed, and the doctors whispered one word that froze my blood poison. Menchau Quivir, you are watching on this channel. Stay with me until the end to hear the whole truth. I woke up that morning thinking it would be just another quiet day. Birthdays don't mean much when you are pushing 70 and living alone. I made my coffee, black and plain, and sat at the kitchen table watching the steam curl into the morning light. The house was still, too still sometimes, and I found myself listening to the tick of the wall clock just to remind myself time was moving. When I opened the front door to fetch the paper, I noticed a box sitting on the porch. Brown cardboard, no ribbons, no card tucked on top like people used to do when they cared enough to stop by in person. I bent down slow, my knees creaking in protest, and picked it up. The box wasn't heavy, but the weight felt wrong, like it carried more than just what was inside. I carried it to the kitchen and set it on the table beside my coffee mug. There was a small envelope taped to the side. My name wasn't on it, just 2 words written in blue ink. Happy birthday. No dad. No signature. Just those 2 words staring at me like they were afraid to say anything else. My chest tightened because I knew that handwriting. It was my son Mark's. For a long moment I didn't open the box. I just sat there staring at the words, my thumb brushing over the envelope. It had been 3 years since I had seen his face or heard his voice. 3 years since the last time we sat in the same room and pretended we were still a family. Now here it was again, his handwriting on my birthday, pulling up feelings I had pushed down so deep I thought they were gone. I tore the tape loose and slid the envelope open. Inside was a plain white card, nothing fancy, just the same 2 words in the middle of the page. Happy birthday. I set it aside, my throat dry, and finally opened the box. Inside was a bottle of whiskey like none I had ever seen before. Dark green glass that caught the light like it had fire trapped inside. Gold lettering on the label, a wax seal on the cork so smooth it looked like it had been poured there by hand. It was the kind of bottle you didn't drink from but displayed on a shelf so people would know you had money or taste or both. My breath caught, not because I wanted a drink, but because I knew this wasn't cheap. Mark had never spent that kind of money without a reason. I picked it up carefully, feeling the cool glass against my palm. Whiskey used to be my comfort. 1 glass after dinner, sitting on the porch with my wife before the heart attack took that choice away. She would pour 2 glasses and we would watch the sun sink behind the trees, letting the crickets fill the silence. Those nights were simple, honest, and they meant the world. I haven't touched a drop since the doctor told me if I wanted to live to see 70, I'd have to leave it all behind. Mark was there in that hospital room. He knew. So why this? Why now? I ran my thumb over the wax seal, the ridges pressing against my skin. My chest felt heavy, not from wanting the whiskey, but from the memory of my son standing in that hospital room, thumbs flying across his phone while the doctor told me what I had to give up. I told myself back then that he was just nervous, distracted, maybe trying to keep himself from breaking down. Now, seeing this bottle in front of me, I wasn't so sure. I set the whiskey down on the far end of the table, away from my coffee, away from me. The house felt even emptier than before. The clock kept ticking, each sound sharp in the silence. I reached for the card again, staring at the 2 words written there, and felt a weight settle in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart. Happy birthday. 2 words that were supposed to mean joy. Instead, they brought back every unanswered question, every Sunday dinner that went by without him, every holiday where his chair sat empty. I whispered his name under my breath, just to see how it sounded after all this time. Mark. The name felt strange on my tongue, like saying it out loud might summon him to my door. but the house stayed silent. Only the whiskey bottle gleamed in the strip of sunlight cutting through the blinds. It looked out of place on my table, like something too fine for a man who spent his life mending fences and pulling weeds. My hands curled into fists without meaning to. That was the gift he chose. A reminder of something I couldn't have, something he knew I had left behind. I took a slow breath and looked at the bottle one more time. It was beautiful, yes, but beauty can be a cruel thing when it comes wrapped in silence. I didn't open it. I didn't even think about it. I turned away, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat back down at the table. My birthday had begun with a gift I couldn't use and a message I couldn't understand. I told myself it was just a bottle, just a gesture, nothing more. But deep down I knew better. Nothing about this felt simple. Not the bottle, not the handwriting, not the silence that hung between us like a locked door. And I had no idea that by setting that bottle aside, I had already set something much darker in motion. It is strange how families come apart. People think it happens in one blowout fight with yelling and slammed doors, but that is not how it was with my son and me. With us, it was silence that did the work. At first, the silences were small. A phone call missed, a dinner skipped, an excuse about being busy with work. I told myself it was normal, that boys grow into men with lives of their own. But the spaces grew wider, and before I knew it, years had passed with nothing but the sound of my own breathing in this house. The last time I remember seeing Mark truly present was at his mother's funeral. He stood at the edge of the cemetery in his dark suit, head bent, hands shoved into his pockets like he was bracing himself against a storm. People came up to me, offering words, offering food, offering anything they could think of. But my son, he barely looked at me. When it was time to leave, he walked straight to his truck without saying a word. That silence stayed with me longer than the sound of the preacher's voice. Later there was the matter of the farm. After Linda passed, I could not handle the upkeep anymore. My body was slowing down, and the doctor's warnings were louder than my own pride. I sold off a portion of the land to cover debts and make sure I had something steady to live on. Mark never forgave me for that. He said the land was supposed to be his one day, said I had taken away the future he counted on. I tried to explain that the land was more burden than blessing, that keeping it would have killed me sooner, but he stopped listening. He carried that resentment like a stone in his pocket, always heavy, always there. After that, he stopped showing up for Sunday dinners. Thanksgiving passed with an empty chair where he should have been. By the second Christmas, I sat staring at the tree lights alone, pretending I did not care, but I cared more than I ever admitted. I even left his stocking hung on the mantel, foolish old habit, as if he might walk through the door at the last minute and laugh at me for still believing. What hurt the most was not the absence, but the way he let it become normal. Calls stopped altogether. When I reached out, my messages sat unanswered. I thought about driving to his house once, thought about knocking on his door and demanding to know why my son had turned into a stranger. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of what he would say, or worse, what he would not. So I stayed quiet. The silence between us grew into something hard and permanent. It was like living in a house with walls too thick for sound to pass through. Sometimes, when I sat on the porch in the evenings, I would remember him as a boy. I remembered his laugh when he caught his first fish, the way his eyes lit up when he rode his bike down the gravel road, his hands stained with grease when we worked on the old Ford together. Those memories cut deeper now, because I could not square them with the man who would not return his father's calls. When the whiskey arrived on my birthday, it pulled all of those memories back like a tide I could not stop. For a moment, I wanted to believe it was a step toward mending things. Maybe this was his way of reaching out, of trying to start over. But then I looked at the bottle, at the gold letters gleaming in the light, and I remembered. He knew I had given up drinking. He was there when the doctor said it. He was there when I promised Linda on her deathbed I would take care of myself. He knew, and yet this was the gift he chose. That was when I understood something I did not want to say out loud. My son did not send me that bottle out of love. He sent it out of something else. Resentment, maybe. Spite, maybe. Or something darker. I stared at his handwriting on that plain white card until the letters blurred. Happy birthday. Just 2 words, but they carried the weight of 3 years of silence. The truth is, silence is its own kind of violence. It chips away at the edges until there is nothing left to hold on to. And the silence between me and my son had already carved out more than I ever thought possible. That bottle on my table was not just a gift. It was a reminder of everything broken between us. And deep down I feared it was also a warning of something yet to come. I sat there staring at that bottle for most of the morning, the green glass catching the strips of light from the blinds. Every time I looked at it, I felt the same mix of heaviness and unease. I did not want it in my house, not when I knew I could never drink it, and not when the sight of it dragged me back to all those memories I had spent years trying to bury. By noon, I made up my mind. I thought of Tom Bradley, my neighbor, and also Lisa's father. Tom was the kind of man who showed up before you even knew you needed him. 2 summers ago, when a storm ripped shingles clean off my roof, I woke up to the sound of hammering and found Tom already up there fixing it. He never waited to be asked. He just did what needed doing. Men like that are rare now. Tom and I were not best friends, not the kind that sit around talking about feelings. But we had a quiet understanding, the kind that comes from years of living near each other, trading tools, and helping when the other was short of a hand. If anyone deserved a gift like that whiskey, it was him. I put the bottle back in its box, careful with the wax seal, and set it on the passenger seat of my truck. I buckled it in, almost laughing at myself for treating a bottle like it was a passenger, but something about it made me uneasy. The sun was already tilting west, throwing a soft amber glow across the fields as I drove down County Road 6. The air smelled faintly of burning leaves, that autumn smell that settles heavy in your chest. When I pulled into Tom's driveway, gravel crunching under the tires, I saw him standing on the porch in his red flannel shirt, jeans stained from some half-finished project. His boots were dusted with sawdust, and I knew he had been in his workshop. He waved as I climbed out, and his eyes immediately landed on the box in my hands. "What's this?" he asked, stepping down from the porch. "A birthday gift," I said, handing it to him. "From Mark." His brows shot up. "From Mark? To you?" "Yeah." I nodded. "Figured you'd get more use out of it than me." Tom carefully lifted the bottle out of the box, turning it in his hands. The sunlight hit the gold lettering, and he let out a low whistle. "This is something, Harold. This is the kind of thing you save for special nights." "Then make tonight special," I said, and I meant it. I felt lighter just seeing it in his hands instead of mine. He grinned, a real grin, and clapped me on the shoulder. "I think I will. Thank you, neighbor." I watched him carry it inside like it was a treasure, and for the first time since I opened that package, I felt like I had done the right thing. Better to see it enjoyed than let it gather dust in my kitchen. Driving home, though, the thought kept circling in my mind. Mark had never been generous with money. I remembered the countless times he had borrowed 20 for gas and never paid it back. I remembered him rolling his eyes when I reminded him to return tools. He was never one for extravagance, yet here was a bottle that must have cost hundreds, maybe more. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Why now? Why this? Why a gift he knew I could not touch? The road stretched out in front of me, fields cut down to stubble, the last of the autumn light, laying long shadows across the ground. I tried to push the questions away, told myself not everything needed a reason. But deep down, I knew better. With Mark, there was always a reason, even if he never said it out loud. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as always, quiet and plain, but I felt different. That bottle was no longer my burden, yet its weight was still heavy on my chest. I tried to shake it off, tried to tell myself I had done a good thing, passing it on to a man who deserved it. But as I walked up my porch steps, I glanced back at the empty passenger seat where the bottle had been. The sun had dipped lower, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. For the briefest moment, I felt something I couldn't name. Not peace, not relief. Something sharper, like a warning carried on the wind. I shook my head, unlocked the door, and went inside. The house was still, the clock ticking steady in the kitchen. I poured myself another cup of coffee, though I didn't really want it, and sat back down at the table. I told myself it was done. The whiskey was gone. The matter was over. But in my gut, I knew it wasn't. That bottle was not finished with me yet. And soon enough, I would learn just how wrong I had been. The next day was quiet. I spent the morning raking leaves out back, the kind of job that makes you ache in every joint but leaves the yard looking halfway decent. By late afternoon, I had a pot roast in the oven and the house filled with the smell of onions and carrots. It was the kind of meal that was better shared, though I was used to eating alone now. I sat at the table with a plate in front of me, cutting slow bites, when the phone rang. It was strange to hear it. Hardly anyone uses the landline anymore. I set my fork down and reached for the receiver, expecting a telemarketer or some charity drive. Instead, I heard a woman's voice, tight and shaken. "Mr. Walker, this is Susan Bradley. You need to know Tom's in the hospital." My fork clattered against the plate. "The hospital? What happened?" Her words came fast, broken by panic. "He collapsed this morning, Harold. 1 minute he was fine, drinking his coffee, and the next he could barely stand. They think it might be some kind of poisoning." Poisoning. The word hit me so hard I thought the air had been punched out of my lungs. I gripped the phone tighter, my eyes flicking to the counter where the box had sat yesterday, where the bottle had been before I carried it to Tom's house. "Was it food?" I asked, though my mouth was already dry with the answer I feared. "We had dinner last night," she said. "Nothing unusual, but he opened that whiskey you gave him. He poured us both a glass. He said it was the nicest bottle he'd ever seen." I closed my eyes, the sound of her voice twisting in my gut. My mind replayed the moment I handed Tom that bottle, the way his eyes lit up, the way he grinned and clapped me on the shoulder. I thought I was giving him something good. Instead, I had given him a poison wrapped in gold letters. "The doctors are running tests," Susan went on, her voice cracking. "They don't know for sure yet, but they're worried. They said it could be some kind of toxin." I swallowed hard, forcing words through the lump in my throat. "Susan, tell them exactly what he drank. Tell them it was a brand new bottle, unopened, sealed. Tell them I still have a small sample from the same bottle." She went quiet on the other end, the hospital sounds humming faintly behind her, the beeping of machines, the shuffle of shoes on tile. Finally she said, "If you think of anything else, anything at all, call me." "I will," I promised, though the promise felt thin. When I hung up, the kitchen felt colder than it had in years. The roast sat untouched on my plate, steam curling off it like it belonged to someone else's dinner. I couldn't eat. My hands shook as I pushed back from the table. I walked to the counter and stared at the empty space where that bottle had sat, a dark green shape in the morning light. Now it was gone, and Tom was fighting for his life. I leaned heavy on the counter, my heart thumping in my chest. It wasn't just guilt I felt. It was the creeping certainty that this hadn't been an accident. Mark had sent me that bottle knowing full well I couldn't drink it. So why send it? Unless it was meant for me in another way. Unless the real gift was not whiskey, but the poison hidden inside it. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady my breathing. My eyes landed on the trash bin. Something white stuck out near the bottom. I pulled it free. A small plastic vial, no label, just a dusting of powder clinging to the inside. I didn't remember throwing it away. My hands trembled as I screwed the cap tighter and set it next to the mason jar where I had poured a splash of whiskey the day before. 2 things I should never have had, sitting on my counter like evidence in a crime. The clock ticked on, each second louder than the last. Outside, the October light faded to gray, the yard settling into shadows. I stood there a long time, listening to the silence press against the walls of my house. Tom was in the hospital, and I was the one who put him there. not by choice, but by my own hand all the same. The phone sat heavy in its cradle. I wanted to call Mark, to demand answers, to shout and curse and ask him what he had done, but my fingers froze before they touched the dial. Something in me knew he would not give me the truth, at least not in words, and something else told me that whatever had begun with that package on my porch was only just starting. I turned off the lights, sat back down at the table, and stared at the cold roast on my plate. I had no appetite. The only thing I could taste was the bitterness of the words Susan had used. Poisoning. It echoed in my ears long after the house had gone quiet. That night, I hardly slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tom's face pale and still, his wife clutching his hand in a hospital bed while machines kept track of the beats his heart struggled to make. I turned from side to side, my chest heavy, my mind running in circles that never ended. By morning, I knew I could not ignore what I had found in my own trash. I made a pot of coffee I never touched and set the small plastic vial in the center of the kitchen table. The sunlight fell across it, catching the faint dust clinging to the inside. It looked harmless, ordinary even, like the kind of bottle vitamins come in. But I knew better. Ordinary things can kill you quicker than a loaded gun if they are twisted into the wrong purpose. Beside it sat the mason jar, half a cup of whiskey left inside, a golden amber swirl when I tilted it. I had poured it absent-mindedly the day I gave Tom the bottle, thinking maybe I would save a little to smell, a way to remember what I used to enjoy. I never imagined it would turn into proof of something darker. Now it looked like a warning sitting there in the light. I sat down with a pen and a yellow pad and wrote 2 lists. On one side I wrote what I knew. Mark sent the bottle. Mark knew I could not drink. Tom collapsed after drinking it. I found a vial in my trash I had not put there. On the other side I wrote what I could prove. That was harder. I had the vial, the whiskey sample, Susan's words about what Tom drank. But proof is not the same as suspicion, and suspicion does not save a man's life. The clock ticked too loud on the wall. My chest ached with every beat, not just from my bad heart, but from the weight of what I was beginning to accept. My own son had sent me a gift that might have been meant to kill me. And if it was not meant for me, then it was meant for someone else, just as close. Either way, it carried his name. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had not called in years. Carl answered on the second ring, his voice rough from too many years breathing in dust and smoke. We had served together 3 decades ago, 2 kids in uniform who thought they were bulletproof. Now he ran a small veterinary lab out on the edge of town. He owed me a favor from a winter when I pulled his truck out of a ditch in a blizzard. "Carl," I said quietly, "I need your help. I have something that needs testing." He asked what it was, and I hesitated. "Whiskey," I said, "and maybe something else." He did not push. He only said to meet him after closing, bring whatever I had, and he would take a look. All afternoon I walked the house, unable to sit still. I checked the locks twice, pulled the curtains closed, and stared out at the street like I expected someone to be watching. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked heavier than it should. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I knew better. Once you find poison in your trash, paranoia becomes common sense. When the sun began to drop, I wrapped the mason jar in a paper bag, set the vial inside my jacket pocket, and drove to the edge of town. The roads looked different that night, empty stretches of pavement broken by fields that seemed too quiet. My truck rattled like it always did, but the sound felt louder in the silence. Carl met me in the parking lot, his lab coat pulled over a sweatshirt, his breath rising in the cool air. He looked at the bag in my hand, then at my face, and nodded without asking questions. "Is this the kind of thing I'll regret looking at?" he asked. "Just tell me what's in it," I said. He took the bag and the vial, holding them carefully, and disappeared inside. I sat in my truck with the engine running, my hands gripping the wheel, staring at the glow of the lab lights through the window. Time stretched thin. I thought about Mark, about the silence on the phone when I told him I had given the bottle to Tom, about the way his voice cooled when he asked if I had tried it. By the time Carl came back out, the sky was almost black, the last light gone from the fields. He leaned into the window of my truck, his face tight. "I'll call you tomorrow. I need to run this twice before I tell you what I think." I nodded, unable to speak, and drove home with the bag gone from the seat beside me. The house was dark when I pulled in, but it did not feel empty. It felt like something was waiting inside, something I could not name yet. I locked the doors, checked them twice, and sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me. The whiskey was gone from my house, but its shadow lingered. Tom was in the hospital, fighting. My son's handwriting sat on the card by the stove. And on my counter lay the notes I had started to keep, black ink carving out the pieces of a story I did not yet understand. I did not know if the truth would save me or bury me, but I knew one thing for certain. That bottle had not been a gift. It had been the start of something I was not ready for, something I could no longer avoid. The call came the next evening, just as I was washing a plate from the simple dinner I had barely eaten. At first I thought it might be Susan again with news from the hospital. I dried my hands on a towel and picked up the receiver. For a moment there was nothing but silence on the line. Then I heard a voice I had not heard in years. "Dad." It was Mark. His tone was casual, too casual, as if 3 years of silence could be smoothed over with a single word. I leaned against the counter, my grip tightening on the receiver. My chest felt heavy, and for a second I thought my heart might give out then and there. "Mark," I said. "Happy birthday," he answered, a beat too late to sound natural. I closed my eyes, the kitchen swimming in front of me. "You sent that bottle." "Yeah," he said lightly. "You got my gift?" I did. A pause stretched out between us, long enough that I heard the clock ticking in the background. Then his tone shifted, sharper, almost urgent. "Well, what'd you think? Did you try it yet?" I felt my stomach twist. The way he asked was not like someone curious about a present. It was like a man checking whether a plan had gone through. My voice stayed even though my throat burned. Number I gave it to Tom Bradley. Silence. Not the kind where the line drops or static fills the gap, but the kind that grows heavy, alive. I held the receiver tighter, waiting. Finally he spoke, and his voice was cold, measured. "You gave it to Tom?" "That's right," I said slowly. I figured he'd enjoy it more than I would. There was a sound like an exhale, slow and deliberate, and then the line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone hum. My hands were trembling when I set it back in the cradle. The kitchen felt wrong, like the air had thickened. I turned off the light and sat at the table, the shadows in the corners looking deeper than usual. I tried to steady my breathing, but my gut wouldn't calm. He had not said much, but what he had not said mattered more. His pause, the edge in his voice, the way he ended the call without a goodbye. None of it felt like love. None of it felt like family. It felt like something darker. I sat there a long while, thinking back to the boy I raised. I remembered him chasing fireflies in the yard, running up the porch steps with a grin wide enough to light the night. I remembered his hands greasy from working on the truck with me, his laugh when the engine finally roared to life. How had that boy grown into the man whose voice sounded like ice over the phone? The longer I thought about it, the worse the chill in my chest became. Tom was in the hospital fighting for his life, and my son's first question was whether I had taken a drink. That was no coincidence. I walked the house, checking every lock, glancing out every window. The yard looked quiet, the street empty, but my skin prickled as if eyes were on me. I made a pot of coffee just for something to do, poured a cup, and left it untouched. My hand drifted toward the pad of paper where I had started keeping notes. I wrote the words exactly as they had been spoken. Mark called, asked if I tried the whiskey. When told, I gave it to Tom, long pause. Voice cold, line disconnected. I stared at the words until they blurred, then tore the page out and slid it into the fireproof box with the others. My evidence, thin as it was, sat in that box like a witness waiting its turn to speak. The house was quiet again, but the silence was no comfort. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. I lay in bed, but sleep would not come. When I did drift off, it was light, restless, broken by the sound of my own heartbeat thudding too loud in my ears. By morning, the weight in my chest had only grown. Whatever Mark's reasons were, they were not simple. And whatever he had meant by sending that bottle, I had no doubt of one thing. His reaction told me more than words ever could. My son was hiding something, and I had only brushed the surface of it. The truth was waiting, and it was darker than I wanted to face. The call from Carl came just after noon. I had been sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the yellow pad where I had scribbled down notes from the night before. My coffee had gone cold again, untouched. When the phone rang, my chest tightened. I picked it up and tried to sound steady. "Harold," Carl said, his voice low and careful. "I've run the test twice. I needed to be sure." I gripped the receiver. "And?" "There's something in that whiskey. White snake root extract. Enough to kill a man with a bad heart. Enough to stop his pulse before anyone knew what happened." The words hit me harder than I expected. I sank into the chair, the phone pressed to my ear. "You're certain?" "I wouldn't call if I wasn't. I checked it against references. The levels are too precise to be an accident. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a mistake, Harold. It was deliberate." I closed my eyes, the room spinning. Deliberate. That word echoed in my head like a hammer, striking the same nail again and again. "Tom drank from that bottle," I whispered. "Then Tom's lucky he's still breathing," Carl said. "And you, Harold? You dodged a bullet." I couldn't speak. My throat closed, my chest tight with a mix of grief, rage, and something I didn't want to name. After a long silence, Carl added, "You need to bring this to the police. I'll back you with my report, but don't sit on it." When I hung up, the house felt smaller, the walls pressing closer. I sat there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, and my own shallow breathing. I looked at the fireproof box on the counter. Inside were the scraps of evidence I had gathered, the card with Mark's handwriting, the vial, the notes I had written down in my own hand. Pieces of a story I didn't want to tell. I thought about Tom lying in that hospital bed, machines keeping track of his heartbeat. I thought about Susan clutching his hand, praying for one more day. And I thought about Mark's voice over the phone, cold as ice, asking if I had tried the whiskey. I stood and paced the kitchen, my hands shaking. I wanted to believe this was all a mistake, that there was some explanation, some way to make sense of it without tearing apart what little family I had left. But Carl's words rang too clear. This wasn't accidental, this was intentional. I poured the cold coffee down the sink and gripped the counter until my knuckles turned white. My own son had sent me poison. Whether it was meant for me or ended up in Tom's glass by chance, the truth was the same. It carried his handwriting. It carried his silence. I pulled the fireproof box onto the table and opened it. One by one I laid out the items, as if putting them in front of me could make the truth easier to swallow. The card, the vial, the mason jar, the notes. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. These were not just objects anymore, they were evidence. My heart ached as I reached for the phone again. The number I needed to dial wasn't one I wanted to, but I knew I couldn't put it off. Not if I wanted to keep Tom alive. Not if I wanted to keep myself alive. When the voice answered, I said quietly, "I need to report something. My name is Harold Walker. I believe I may have information about a poisoning." I gave them the details, each word heavy on my tongue. The birthday gift, the whiskey bottle, the collapse at dinner, the vial I found, my son's name. When I finished, there was silence on the other end. Then the officer said they would send someone to speak with me. I hung up and sat back, my hand trembling against the receiver. Outside, the October light had turned pale, the trees casting long shadows across the yard. The porch swing creaked, though there was no wind I could see. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, thinking of the nights Linda and I had sat there together, 2 glasses of whiskey between us, laughter filling the air. Now all I had was a bottle turned into a weapon, a son I could no longer recognize, and a house that felt more like a cage with every hour. The truth was out in the open now, and once spoken it couldn't be taken back. The detective showed up at my door just before dusk. I had been pacing the floor for an hour, checking the curtains, glancing at the street, listening for footsteps that never came. When the knock finally sounded, sharp and deliberate, my chest tightened. I opened the door to find a man in plain clothes, a badge clipped to his belt, his eyes sharp but calm. "Mr. Walker," he said, extending a hand. "Detective Miller." I let him in, the house suddenly feeling smaller with another body inside it. He moved with the kind of steadiness that comes from years of walking into rooms where the truth is trying to hide. He sat at my kitchen table while I gathered the things I had set aside. I placed the mason jar, the vial sealed in a plastic bag, and the card with Mark's handwriting in front of him. My hands trembled as I slid the items across the table. "This is what I have," I said quietly. He didn't rush. He pulled on a pair of gloves and examined each item carefully. The way he handled them told me he had done this 100 times before. He studied the card, tilting it under the light. "You're certain this is your son's handwriting?" "I'd know it anywhere," I said. "I watched him learn to write his name at this very table. Those loops on the H, that tilt on the Y. They're his." He gave a short nod and set it aside. When he picked up the mason jar, the liquid inside caught the light. "You haven't drunk from this?" "Number." I poured it the day the package arrived, before I gave the bottle away. I don't know why I kept it. Habit, maybe. Or maybe something in me knew I'd need it. "And the vial?" he asked, holding it up between his fingers. "I found it in my trash. No label, no memory of throwing it away. Just there." He studied it, then slipped it back into the bag. His expression didn't change, but the air in the room grew heavier. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you've done the right thing bringing this forward. We'll need to send these to the state lab for confirmation. If your friend's preliminary results are accurate, this is serious." I leaned forward, my voice breaking. "Tom Bradley is in the hospital right now because of that bottle. His wife said the doctors think it was poison. This isn't just serious. This is life and death." The detective met my eyes. His voice was steady, professional. "I understand. But we build these cases on evidence, not feelings. That's why I need you to keep documenting everything. Every call, every message, every detail you remember. Don't throw anything away." I nodded, my throat tight. "You think my son did this?" He didn't answer right away. He folded his hands on the table and spoke carefully. "What I think doesn't matter yet. What we can prove does. Right now we have a bottle, a sample, a vial, and your testimony. If the lab confirms the poison, we'll have more. Until then, you need to stay cautious." I pressed my palms against the table, trying to steady myself. "He called me last night, asked if I'd tried it. When I told him I gave it to Tom, he went silent. Then he hung up." The detective pulled out a small notebook and wrote it down. "Good. Keep track of that. Write the time, the exact words, the way he sounded. These details matter." I told him everything, every word, every pause, every silence that felt heavier than sound. When I finished, he closed his notebook and slipped it back into his jacket. "Mr. Walker," he said firmly, "I need you not to speak to your son again. Not in person, not on the phone. If he reaches out, let it go to voicemail. Save everything. If he shows up here, call us immediately. Do not open the door. Do you understand?" I wanted to argue, wanted to say that he was my son and I deserved to hear the truth from his own mouth. But the weight in the detective's voice told me what I needed to hear. "I understand," I said. He stood, gathering the evidence with the kind of care you give to something fragile and dangerous at the same time. At the door he paused. "You've carried this weight alone long enough. Let us carry it from here." When he left, the house fell quiet again. I locked the door, checked it twice, and leaned my forehead against the wood. The porch swing creaked outside, though the air was still. I walked back to the kitchen and sat at the table, staring at the empty space where the jar and the vial had been. The house felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter because the burden was no longer just mine. Heavier because now it was real, official, written down in a detective's notebook and sealed in plastic bags. I opened the fireproof box and slid in a fresh card. Today's date. Gave evidence to police. Detective Miller advised no contact with Mark. My handwriting shook, but the words were clear. I closed the box, set it back on the shelf, and sat there listening to the house breathe. For the first time, I realized I was no longer just a father worried about his son. I was a witness in something darker, something that had stepped far beyond family. That night I walked the house the way a soldier walks the perimeter of a camp. Every window latch, every door lock, every shadow that stretched across the floor was something to check and double-check. I used to fall asleep without thinking twice about the doors. This was a small town. Folks here still left keys under flower pots and waved at each other from porches. But now the house felt different. It felt like the walls were thinner, like the locks were nothing but flimsy promises. I remembered what Detective Miller had told me. Don't talk to Mark. Don't open the door. Keep everything documented. His words echoed in my head as I stood by the front door, staring at the brass deadbolt. I noticed a scuff I had never seen before. A faint scrape near the strike plate, light catching on the fresh metal. It was small, almost nothing, the kind of thing most people wouldn't see. But I knew this door. I had opened it thousands of times. That mark hadn't been there yesterday. The thought chilled me. Someone had been trying a key. Not breaking, not forcing, but turning a key that didn't fit quite right. My heart thudded hard against my ribs. I bent down and ran a finger across the scrape, the cold metal rough under my skin. It was like the house itself was telling me someone had been here when I wasn't looking. I went to the junk drawer and pulled out a spool of thread. Old habit. I taped a strand across the bottom of the door frame, clear and low enough that no one would notice. If someone opened that door while I slept, the thread would break. A quiet alarm. A trick I had learned years ago from a corporal who was tired of finding his locker rifled through. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to hold on to. The rest of the night I set small traps in my own house. I wedged a chair against the back door, even though I knew it would not stop anyone determined. I put one of those cheap battery alarms on the side entrance to the garage. I tested it twice, opening the door just enough to hear the shrill scream. The sound cut through the house like a knife and left my ears ringing, but it gave me a strange comfort. At least I would know. Sleep was impossible. I sat in my chair in the living room, the hall light on, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old house. Every sound made me twitch. I caught myself staring at the fireproof box more than once, as if the evidence inside was a magnet drawing trouble toward me. My son's card, the notes I had written, the dates I had logged. Proof that couldn't be denied, but proof that felt like a curse every time I looked at it. Just after midnight, I thought I heard something outside. A shuffle on the porch, faint but real. I held my breath and waited. The porch swing moved once, then stilled. There was no wind. I stayed frozen in my chair for what felt like an hour, my hands gripping the armrests. Eventually the night sank back into silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforts. It was the kind that watches. By morning my nerves were frayed. The coffee pot hissed and popped as it brewed, the sound making me flinch like a gunshot. I walked through the house again, checking the thread at the door. Still there, still tight, but the scrape on the lock glared back at me, proof enough that someone had tried. Later that afternoon, as the sun was sliding low, I stepped out to get the mail. My yard looked the same, the street quiet, kids' bikes leaning against a neighbor's fence. But when I turned back toward the house, I saw something stuffed in the handle of the back door. A folded piece of paper, thick black marker bleeding through. I pulled it free and opened it with shaking hands. The message was short. Stop letting them in or I will. No signature, no envelope, just those words. My stomach dropped, my chest heavy as if a stone had been set inside me. I looked up and down the street, but no one was there. Whoever had left it had been close enough to touch my door and quiet enough to slip away unseen. I carried the note inside, my fingers trembling. I laid it on the table and stared at it until the letters blurred. The message was clear enough. It was not just about the police. It was about me. About the fact that I had not played the part expected of me, that I had stepped outside the silence. The house no longer felt safe. Every shadow looked like it was hiding something. Every creak of the floorboards made me think of someone moving where they shouldn't be. I put the note in a plastic sleeve, wrote the time and date on an index card, and slid it into the fireproof box. When the night came again, I did not bother with bed. I set a chair in the corner of the living room where I could see both doors. The alarms were set, the thread was in place, and the note's words burned in my mind. Stop letting them in, or I will. I sat there with the lamp on, the silence pacing the house like a predator, and I knew that from this moment forward, I was living in a different kind of home. It wasn't just four walls anymore. It was a battleground. I went to the hospital the next morning, carrying a knot in my chest that wouldn't ease. The note from my door still burned in my pocket. The walk down the sterile white hall felt like moving through a dream where the lights were too bright and the air smelled of chemicals that never quite covered the scent of sickness. When I reached Tom's room, I saw Susan sitting close to his bed, her hands folded tight, lips moving in silent prayer. Machines hummed steady beside him, the slow rhythm of a heart that had nearly been silenced. I stood at the doorway for a moment, afraid to step inside, afraid that the weight of my guilt might press too hard on the room already heavy with worry. Susan looked up, her eyes tired and red. "Harold," she whispered. "Thank you for coming." I walked in, my boots sounding too loud on the linoleum. Tom looked pale, thinner than I had ever seen him, his chest rising slow under the blanket. I laid a hand on the rail of his bed, feeling the cold metal beneath my palm. "How is he?" I asked. "They're keeping him stable," she said. "They found traces of something unusual in his blood. They're running more tests." I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to confess everything right there. The words crowded my throat, but before I could speak, the door opened and Lisa walked in. My daughter-in-law. Mark's wife? Tom's daughter. She looked different than I remembered, her hair pulled back tight, her face pale, eyes sharp from sleepless nights. She froze when she saw me, as though she hadn't expected I would be here. "Lisa," I said quietly, nodding. She managed a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm glad you're here," she said. Then she looked at her mother. "Can I have a word with Harold?" Susan hesitated, glanced between us, then stood and touched Tom's hand before slipping into the hall. The door clicked shut, leaving just the two of us with the machines and the shallow sound of Tom's breathing. Lisa stepped closer, her voice low, tight. "I don't know how much you know, but I can't stay quiet anymore." Her words made the hair on the back of my neck rise. "Go on," I said. She wrung her hands, her knuckles white. "Mark has been different for a long time. Distant, secretive, he spends hours in the garage with jars of dried plants. He calls it a hobby, says he's into herbal medicine or natural remedies, but it doesn't feel right." My chest tightened. "Jars?" "Yes," she whispered. "Glass jars with labels, strange names I didn't recognize. He's on those online groups about extraction, about how to pull toxins from plants. At first I thought it was harmless, maybe even some silly obsession. But then I saw the word snake root on his search history. I didn't know what it meant, but now—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes shining with fear. I gripped the rail harder, the cold biting into my skin. "White snake root," I said. She nodded quickly, eyes wide. "Yes, that's it. I thought it was just reading, just curiosity. But I should have said something sooner. I didn't think he—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "He's my husband. I didn't want to believe he could hurt anyone." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I looked at Tom, still pale, still fragile, and then back at her. "Lisa, you need to tell the police what you just told me. Detective Miller is already involved. He needs to know about those jars, the searches, all of it. Her hands shook as she pulled her phone from her pocket. I already called. I left a message last night, told them I had information. I didn't know who else to turn to. Relief and grief tangled in my chest. I wanted to thank her, but the words felt wrong. Instead, I said, "Save everything you have. Screenshots, photos, anything that shows what he's been doing. Don't delete a thing." She looked at me, her eyes full of fear, but also something else resolve. "Why would he do this?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why would he try to hurt you? Why would he risk his own family?" I could have told her about the resentment, the bitterness over the farm, the years of silence that hardened into something cruel. I could have spoken of the coldness in his voice when he called, of the way he hung up after I told him the bottle had gone to Tom, but the truth came out in words that felt heavier than all of that. Because if he can't own the story, he'll burn the page. She flinched as if the words themselves stung. She glanced at her father again, then back at me. "He asked me this morning if I'd heard from you. He wanted to know if you liked the bottle." Her lips trembled. "I told him you'd given it to my dad." We stood in silence for a moment, the steady beep of the monitor filling the air. Between us hung a truth too heavy to lift. Finally I said, "Thank you for telling me." "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I knew she meant every word. The door opened then, Susan returning with a nurse, and Lisa stepped back, her face returning to a mask of composure. I stayed by the bed a little longer, listening to the machine keep time with Tom's fragile heart. But when I left the room, I carried Lisa's words with me like stones in my pocket. That night, when I locked my doors and checked the thread across the frame, the house felt darker than ever. The note still sat in the fireproof box, its words echoing in my mind. "Stop letting them in or I will." I thought of Lisa's confession, of the jars in the garage, of the word snake root glowing on a computer screen. I knew then that my son was not just lost to me. He was building something dangerous in the silence between us, and the silence had already spilled into blood. Detective Miller called me 2 days later. His voice was clipped, no wasted words. "Mr. Walker, we executed a warrant on your son's property this morning. We found items that confirm your suspicions." I sat down hard in the chair by the window, my hand gripping the armrest until my knuckles whitened. "What did you find?" 3 glass jars, labeled WSR. Dried plant material consistent with white snake root, a notebook with dosage calculations, and an envelope addressed to you. Inside was a short note, your name at the top. The words, "You'll understand why when it's over," at the bottom. Nothing else but a drawing of a tree with its roots circled. My stomach turned cold. I pressed the phone harder to my ear, as if it would make his words change. "And Mark?" He wasn't there. His wife cooperated fully, allowed the search, gave us his devices. But he's avoiding us. We're putting out a locate order. I looked out the window at my yard, at the bare trees stretching like bones against the sky. "So he's running." Miller was quiet a moment, then said, "That note, the jars, the notebook, they move this from suspicion to evidence. The net is tightening. But I have to warn you, Mr. Walker, people who feel cornered can be dangerous." I hung up and sat there staring at my own reflection in the glass, the weight of his words pressing on me. My son had been preparing this for months, maybe longer. The notebook alone proved that. And now he knew the police were closing in. That night, I couldn't sit still. I walked through the house again and again, checking the thread at the door, checking the alarms, checking the locks, until my fingers ached from turning the knobs. I pulled the fireproof box onto the table and spread out the cards I had written. Each one was a step, a breadcrumb leading to the truth I didn't want to face. Mark's gift, Tom's collapse, the vial in the trash, the call where his voice went cold, Lisa's confession, now the jars, the notes, the letter. The letter haunted me most. "You'll understand why when it's over." What did that mean? Was it a confession? A threat? Or some twisted attempt at justification? I imagined him sitting in his garage, pens scratching across the paper, believing those words explained everything. I thought of the boy who once asked me why the sky changed colors at dusk. I thought of the man who now poisoned whiskey bottles and left threats on doors. Somewhere between those two versions was the son I lost, but I no longer knew where to look for him. Later that evening the phone rang again. It was Susan, her voice steady but heavy. "The doctors say Tom's improving. They're moving him out of the critical unit tomorrow." Relief washed through me, sharp and sudden, but it was tangled with guilt. "That's good news," I managed. "Yes," she said softly. "But Harold, he keeps asking about Mark. He thinks this was just a bad accident. He doesn't know the rest. Not yet." I couldn't answer. My throat closed. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen with my head in my hands. Tom was healing, but the wound inside my own house was still wide open. Around midnight, I heard a car idle outside. I moved to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. A dark sedan sat at the corner, headlights off. After a minute, it rolled away, slow and deliberate. I stood there long after it was gone, listening to the blood rush in my ears. The next morning, Miller called again. "We've issued a warrant for his arrest. If he contacts you, do not respond. Call us immediately." "Do you think he'll come here?" I asked. "Maybe. You're still the center of this, Mr. Walker. Be prepared." Prepared. The word rattled around my head all day. I installed new deadbolts on both doors, the metal cold under my hands as I drilled. I tested the alarms again, their shrill cry cutting through the silence. Still, none of it felt like enough. A lock can only do so much when the danger carries your last name. That evening, I stepped out on the porch and looked at the swing. It moved once, though the air was still. The chains groaned the way they always did, but now it sounded less like comfort and more like warning. I sat down, the wood cold beneath me, and stared at the empty street. Somewhere out there my son was hiding, and the police were hunting him. The walls were closing in, and I was caught in the middle. When I finally went back inside, I added a new card to the fireproof box. Police found jars, notes, letter, Mark avoiding them, net tightening. I closed the lid and set it back on the shelf, the click of the metal sounding final. The house was silent again, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence before something breaks. I knew it in my bones. The net was tightening, and sooner or later something was going to give. The first time I saw Mark again was in the courtroom. Weeks had passed since the police brought him in. Weeks of restless nights and days that dragged like years. When the deputies led him through the side door, his hands cuffed in front of him, my chest tightened so hard I thought I might collapse right there. He looked thinner, his jaw set, his eyes cold and flat. He did not look at me at first, but when he finally did, his gaze cut straight through me. No warmth, no flicker of the boy I raised, only something hard and distant. The courtroom itself felt like a furnace that day. The air smelled of wood polish and old paper, the benches filled with neighbors who whispered when they thought no one could hear. I sat at the front with the prosecutor, my palms damp, my heart pounding with every sound of the gavel. Detective Miller gave me a short nod from across the aisle, his face unreadable. The prosecutor began with a clean, sharp voice. He spoke of trust, of betrayal, of how a gift given from a son to a father nearly ended 2 lives. He pointed toward the evidence on the table, the whiskey bottles sealed in a plastic bag, the jars taken from Mark's garage, the notebook filled with calculations. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes shifting between the prosecutor and my son. When it was the defense's turn, Mark's lawyer rose with a calm smile, smooth as oil. He painted me as bitter, resentful, a man angry at his son for past grievances. He spoke of property disputes, of land I had sold, of family tension stretched too far. He tried to make it sound like I had invented the entire story as some twisted revenge. I sat still, my jaw tight, fighting the urge to shout him down. The first witness was Tom. He walked slow with his cane, his wife steadying him as he made his way to the stand. His voice was firm despite the weakness in his body. He told the jury about the night he opened the bottle, about the bitter taste, about the sudden sickness that left him on the floor by morning. He said the doctors told him he might not be alive if he had drunk more. The defense lawyer tried to twist his words, suggesting that Tom had mixed his medications with alcohol, that the collapse was his own fault. Tom looked him straight in the eye and said, "Son, I've been on those pills for a decade. Never once did they put me in the hospital until that whiskey touched my lips." The jury nodded. Some of them even smiled faintly, and I felt a flicker of hope. Then Detective Miller took the stand. He laid out the timeline with the precision of a man who had lived inside the case. He spoke of the lab tests, of the poison confirmed in the whiskey, of the search warrant that uncovered jars of white snake root and dosage notes in Mark's handwriting. He read aloud one of the messages traced to a burner phone. "Make sure he gets it all in the first pour. Won't take much with his heart." The words echoed through the courtroom like a hammer strike. Some jurors looked shocked. One woman pressed her lips together as though holding back anger. Finally, it was my turn. I swore the oath, my hand trembling, and sat at the stand with the microphone inches from my mouth. The prosecutor guided me through it gently. I told them about my birthday morning, about opening the package, about seeing my son's handwriting after 3 years of silence. I told them how I gave the bottle to Tom because of my heart condition. I told them about the phone call, the way Mark asked if I had tried it, the long pause when I said Tom had. I spoke of the fear in my chest, the vial I found in the trash, the thread across my door. My voice cracked more than once, but I forced the words out. When the defense rose, his questions came sharp. "Mr. Walker, isn't it true you haven't spoken to your son in years?" "Yes." "And isn't it true you sold land he believed would one day be his?" "Yes." "So you admit to bitterness between you, to a strained relationship." I steadied my voice. "Strained, yes, but not imagined, not invented." "And none of that explains poison in a bottle of whiskey." He smirked, holding up a paper. "We have here a handwriting analysis from an expert who claims the note you say your son wrote could not have been his. Isn't it possible you misremembered? That grief and resentment colored your perception?" I felt heat rise in my chest, but I met his gaze. "I watched that boy's hand write for 20 years. I know his letters like I know the lines in my own palm. That was his hand. Whatever your paper says, I know." The judge called for order when murmurs filled the room. I stepped down from the stand, my legs heavy, my heart pounding so loud I thought everyone could hear it. As I passed by Mark, I felt his eyes on me. When I glanced his way, he gave the faintest smirk, as if the entire thing were a game he was winning. I sat back down, my hands shaking, the weight of the trial pressing down harder than any gavel. The battle was far from over, but I knew one thing, as sure as I knew my own name. Whatever happened in that room, I was no longer just a father fighting for truth. I was a man staring at the wreckage of his own bloodline, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The day they called me back to the stand for cross-examination, I felt like I was walking into a storm with no shelter. The courtroom was packed tighter than before, the air buzzing with the low hum of whispers. I avoided looking at Mark, but I could feel his eyes on me like a weight pressing down. He was seated beside his lawyer, wearing that same blank face he'd worn since the first day. Only now his jaw was clenched like stone. The defense lawyer wasted no time. He leaned against the rail, his voice smooth but sharp as he tried to cut me open in front of the jury. He asked about old arguments, about land I sold without Mark's blessing, about how we had drifted apart. He painted a picture of a bitter father desperate to ruin his son's life because of old grudges. His words slid across the room like oil, but underneath I could hear the accusation plain enough. He wanted them to believe I was the vengeful one. I tried to keep my voice steady. I answered simply, "Yes, we had disagreements. Yes, I sold land. Yes, we had been distant." But I refused to let him twist that into the reason Tom nearly died. I looked straight at the jury and said, "Whatever mistakes we made in the past, they don't put poison in a man's glass. My son did that." For the first time since the trial began, Mark reacted. He shifted in his seat, his lips curling into the faintest sneer. It was gone in a second, but I saw it. The lawyer must have seen it too, because he stepped back quickly and ended his questions. When I left the stand, I caught Mark's eyes. For a moment, the world around us disappeared. No jury, no judge, no lawyers. Just the two of us, father and son, staring across a canyon that could never be crossed again. His gaze was steady, but it wasn't the look of a man pleading for forgiveness. It was the look of someone daring me to keep pushing. During the recess, I sat alone in the hallway. People passed by, whispering, staring. I pressed my hands together, trying to calm the tremor that had taken hold of me. Detective Miller sat down beside me without asking. "You held your ground," he said. I nodded, though inside I didn't feel steady at all. "He wanted me to break," I whispered. "He wanted me to doubt what I know." Miller shook his head. "You didn't break. You told the truth. That's all that matters." When the trial resumed, the prosecutor called Lisa. She walked to the stand with her shoulders tight, her face pale but determined. Her voice trembled at first, but soon it grew stronger. She told the jury about the jars in the garage, about the search history she found on the computer, about the night Mark asked her if I had enjoyed the bottle. Every word landed heavy. I could feel the room shift as she spoke. Mark stared at her the entire time, his expression darkening, his jaw flexing. When the defense tried to shake her, she held firm. She admitted she had ignored signs for too long, admitted she hadn't wanted to believe the man she married was capable of such a thing. But when she said, "I saw the word snake root on his screen with my own eyes," the silence in the courtroom grew heavy. No one doubted what she meant. The defense objected, called her bitter, suggested she was trying to protect her father at her husband's expense. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the truth in her eyes. That evening, when the session ended, the deputies moved Mark toward the side door. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto me. This time he spoke, his voice low but clear enough for me to hear. "You think this makes you stronger, Dad? You think putting me in chains makes you the better man?" I stood, my fists tightening at my sides. "No," I said, my voice rough. "It makes me the man who's still alive." His face twisted, not with shame, but with anger. The deputies pulled him away before he could say more, but his glare stayed with me long after he was gone. That night, I sat on the porch, under a sky thick with stars, the air cool against my face. I thought about the boy I once taught to throw a baseball, the boy who used to run across the yard laughing, his hair sticking up in the wind. I thought about the man in handcuffs, the man who tried to put me in the ground, and I wondered how one could become the other. It felt like I was already mourning him, even though he was still alive. Mourning the son I lost long before this trial, long before the bottle, long before the silence. Mourning the family we could have been if pride and anger hadn't carved us apart. The battle wasn't over. The verdict hadn't been read. But in that moment I realized something deeper than guilt or anger. This was no longer about proving what he had done. It was about surviving what we both had become. Father against son, blood against blood. And there was no winning in that kind of war. Only surviving long enough to tell the story. The morning of the verdict, the sky was gray and heavy. The kind of sky that made you feel like the world was holding its breath. I woke before the alarm, before the birds, sitting at the edge of my bed staring at the floor. My hands shook as I tied my shoes, not from age, not from my heart, but from the weight of what was coming. At the courthouse, the hallways buzzed with footsteps and whispers. Neighbors I had known for years nodded politely, their eyes flicking away the moment I looked back. I walked into the courtroom and took my seat, the wood of the bench hard beneath me, the air smelling of polish and stale coffee. Tom sat 2 rows behind me, his cane propped against his leg, his face pale but steady. Susan had her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. Lisa sat beside her, eyes lowered, her jaw set. Then they brought Mark in. The chains on his wrists clinked faintly, a sound that cut into me sharper than any knife. He kept his chin high, his eyes forward, but when he turned and caught sight of me, his gaze lingered. No sadness, no plea, only a look that dared me to hold steady. The judge entered, the gavel struck, and the air thickened. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. I found myself holding my breath as the foreman rose, a sheet of paper in his hand. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls themselves might crack under the pressure. "On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree," the foreman said, his voice calm and steady, "we find the defendant guilty." The words struck me like a hammer. Guilty. It echoed through my chest, through my bones, louder than the murmurs that rippled across the room. My heart pounded hard, each beat sharp as a nail. The judge asked for order, her gavel tapping against the wood. The foreman continued, reading through the other charges. Tampering with evidence. Possession of a controlled toxic substance. Guilty. Guilty. Each one landed heavier than the last. I glanced back at Tom. He closed his eyes and let out a long breath, Susan gripping his hand like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Lisa's shoulders shook as silent tears rolled down her face. And Mark. My son sat still, his jaw tight, his face unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't look at the jury, didn't bow his head. When the judge read the sentence, his eyes finally moved. 25 years in state prison. No possibility of parole for the first 15. The words filled the air like smoke, impossible to escape. My hands clenched into fists on my knees. I wanted to feel relief, to believe justice had been served, but what I felt instead was a hollow ache. Justice is a word for paper. It does not glue back what has been shattered. The bailiffs moved to escort him out. Just before he reached the door, Mark turned his head toward me. Our eyes met, father and son, and for a brief second I saw the boy he had been, the boy who once ran laughing through my yard. Then his lips moved, barely forming words, but I understood them. "This isn't over." The deputies pulled him through the door, and the sound of it closing echoed through the courtroom. It felt final, like the slam of a coffin lid, yet his words lingered, coiling tight in my chest. When the judge dismissed us, the benches creaked as people stood, their whispers filling the air again. Some looked at me with pity, others with curiosity, as though I were part of some play they had just watched unfold. I stood slowly, my legs heavy, my hands trembling. Outside, the air was sharper, the wind cutting cold across my face. Reporters weren't waiting. This wasn't the kind of case that made headlines outside our county, but I could feel eyes on me just the same. Tom shuffled out behind me, his cane clicking against the pavement. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did what you had to do, Harold. Don't let anyone tell you different." I nodded, though I didn't answer, because deep down I wasn't sure. I walked alone to my truck, slid into the seat, and sat there with my hands on the wheel. The courthouse loomed behind me, its brick walls solid and cold. In my lap sat the envelope the clerk had handed me, Mark's property inventory. Inside were his watch, his wallet, and a folded note. I opened it with hands that trembled. His handwriting stared back at me. "You always said we were more alike than I wanted to admit. Maybe now you'll see that's not a compliment." No signature, no explanation, just that. I folded it slowly and placed it in the glove box, shutting it with a soft click. I started the engine, the rumble filling the silence, and drove away. The road stretched long and empty ahead of me. Justice had been spoken, the verdict delivered, but peace was nowhere to be found. I felt as though I had gained safety at the cost of my own blood, and the question that lingered in the back of my mind was whether the price had been worth it. The sky stayed gray as I drove, the weight of the word guilty still pressing heavy on my chest. Winter settled in before I realized how much time had passed since the verdict. The days grew short, the evenings colder, and the silence in my house stretched long and heavy. I kept the fireproof box on the top shelf of the closet, its weight always in the back of my mind, a reminder that some truths never stay buried. Sometimes at night, I would open it and read the cards again, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of the life I once knew. Tom recovered faster than anyone expected. By Christmas, he was strong enough to sit at his own table with Susan fussing over him and Lisa moving quietly through the kitchen. I stopped by one evening with a pie, and when Tom opened the door, his smile was weak but real. "You look tired," he told me. I laughed, though it didn't reach my chest. "You should see yourself," I said, and we both chuckled the way old men do when humor is the only medicine left. Yet even in those moments of comfort, I couldn't shake the shadow of Mark. His absence sat at every table, filled every pause in conversation. Lisa carried it on her face, the shame of a woman caught between loyalty and betrayal. I told her once quietly that none of this was her fault. She nodded but didn't speak. Some wounds don't heal with words. At home, the days blended together. I fixed things that didn't need fixing, oiled squeaky hinges, replaced bulbs that still burned. The house looked the same as it always had, but it no longer felt like mine. The locks were stronger now, the alarms louder, yet none of it eased the weight in my chest. Every creak in the floorboards made me listen. Every hum of the refrigerator reminded me of the nights I thought someone was inside. The porch swing became my refuge. It had been there for years, its chains groaning with each sway. Linda and I used to sit there after dinner, letting the crickets sing us into the night. I fixed it after the trial, tightened the bolts, replaced the cracked slats, and for the first time in months it moved smoothly, no splintering, no creaks. On cold afternoons I would sit there with a cup of black coffee, the steam rising into the air, and watch the street. Neighbors walked their dogs, kids rode bikes, the world went on. Yet I always felt eyes on me, even when the road was empty. One evening, a light snow began to fall. The flakes gathered on the railing, soft and quiet. I sat on the swing with my coat buttoned high and thought about Mark. I pictured him in a cell somewhere, his eyes still sharp, his words still lingering. This isn't over. I thought about the note he left me, the handwriting that carried both my past and my future. You'll see we're more alike than I wanted to admit. I wondered if he wrote it to hurt me, or if some part of him believed it was true. I looked at the fireproof box earlier that day, opened it, and added one last envelope. Inside I placed photographs of Mark as a boy, him holding a baseball glove too big for his hand, him grinning beside the old Ford we rebuilt in the garage, him with frosting smeared on his cheeks at his 10th birthday. I wrote on the envelope, "Do not open until you need to remember." Then I sealed it and set it on top of the others. Maybe one day I'll burn it all. Maybe one day I'll need it to keep myself steady. For now, it stays. As the snow thickened, I leaned back and let the swing rock gently. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the yard. The quiet was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that waits, that watches. I don't fool myself into thinking this story is finished. The gavel fell, the sentence was read, but Mark's words follow me like footprints I cannot erase. Maybe he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Maybe one day I'll see his face again, older, harder, still carrying that same look. I don't know. What I do know is that the porch swing still moves, smooth and steady, carrying me through the silence. I raised my cup into the cold air, a small toast to no one but myself. To endings, I whispered, and to whatever comes after. The swing rocked, the snow fell, and I sat there listening to the world breathe, knowing some chapters close with a bang, and others with nothing more than the slow creak of chains on a winter night. Justice was served that day when the jury spoke, but justice is not the same as peace. My son sits behind bars, yet his shadow still lingers in every corner of my home, in every creak of the porch swing where I sit and think about the family we once were. I survived, Tom survived, but the scars will remain. Sometimes the deepest betrayal comes not from strangers but from our own blood. What about you, dear friends? Do you believe justice is enough, or does true peace ever return after such wounds? Share your thoughts below.